Dr. Lalonde, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's such a pleasure. Actually, one of my listeners to this podcast said, if you had Matt Lalonde on, I said, who's Matt Lalonde? So I started looking into who you were, and you really do have quite a background about how you got involved with this whole issue of nutrition and its relationship to health. Tell us that story.
I've always been interested in nutrition. In fact, when I was in high school, there's a biology professor that noticed that, and he bought me a book that you might be familiar with. It was Diet for a New America by John Robbins. And back then, I'd say before I reached the age of reason, I bought the arguments that were spelled out in the book, and I became a vegan. In fact, I was a vegan for 2 years, and then I was a vegetarian for 8 years.
Wow.
About 10 years total. And after I started I was in fact sedentary for most of my life, I should also say. And only when I got to grad school did my advisor, my PhD advisor, convince me to start doing a little bit of exercise. He came in one day and he said, I went to the gym today and I bench pressed 200 pounds. And I'm thinking, gee, I could probably bench press 200 pounds. And so I started exercising, paying a little bit more attention to what I was eating. One day, went to see this movie. I'm not a huge fan of movies, but went to see this movie, The 300, and wondered how the heck the guys had obtained those kinds of results. It's obvious that the film is enhanced via computers, but I was just wondering how they got those results. And you do a little bit of searching, and you find the name Mark Twight.
Yeah.
Twight owns Jim Jones. Mark Twight used to be affiliated with something called CrossFit. So I started doing this 300 workout that you can find online, and that was given to some of the elite participants in the 300 movie. And one day, someone at the gym walks by and says, hey, are you doing CrossFit? I said, no, what the heck is CrossFit? He said, we'll just go look it up online. And through CrossFit found both the Zone diet as well as the paleo diet and Rob Wolf. And I was quite intrigued with all of this because it was exactly the opposite of what I'd been doing for decades. And I'll admit, I was never really obese, but I can't say that my body composition was really ideal, certainly not as good as it is today.
Right.
So I started delving into the science of vegetarianism and veganism, and I realized that it is heavily biased and or flawed. Biased in the way that a lot of the arguments are based on unsustainable agriculture, which is grain agriculture. So it is completely true that feeding grains to animals and then butchering and eating those animals is not sustainable. There is absolutely no doubt about that. It's insane. It is a complete insanity. But then you also have to realize that grain agriculture itself is not sustainable as currently practiced, given that annuals deplete the soil of nutrients and then will eventually turn it to dust. Iran and Iraq are right now part of what is used to be called the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture arose. And they are now deserts because of excessive grain agriculture. So all of that led me to change my diet and adopt the paleo diet. But I have to say I was very skeptical of the paleo diet at first, and I think any scientist would be. And that's because the paleo diet mostly uses this anthropological approach to selling the diet.
Right.
That is, cavemen used to do this. It worked for them. Modern hunter-gatherers don't have diseases of modern civilization, hence you should eat this way.
Right.
And I think any scientist will realize that that is merely an observation. It does not mean cause and effect. It is the same thing as epidemiology. It is the same thing that Ansel Keys has done. You cannot say that works until you go in and you perform randomized controlled trials. You just can't say that. So I started looking into the science behind it, and I found, I realize now that the anthropological approach is kind of a shortcut, and there is plenty of science behind this, and there's a really good way to justify eating this way. And I felt like that needed to be taught. As a scientist, I felt like that different approach needed to be taken. And like a true scientist, I'm very blunt and honest about this is what we know and this is what we don't know. These things are hypotheses. They could or could not be true. But at the end of the day, the overall result doesn't change. For example, it's been shown that if you eat a whole lot of arachidonic acid, it doesn't change your eicosanoid production a whole lot. But we do know that if you fix the omega-3, omega-6 ratio, that your health improves, that you get plenty of benefits from that you lean out, especially if you remove linoleic acid, for example. So at the end of the day, when you dig into the science of all this stuff, it really comes down to, I guess, three major things. There would be excess linoleic acid in our diet, there would be excess fructose in our diet, and then there's a variety of factors, nutritional factors, that will cause something called a leaky gut that can trigger autoimmune diseases or inflammation and can actually worsen the metabolic syndrome itself.
Right. Now, Matt, I've got to ask you, who are some of your, inspirations? Who are the people that are really excite you in this field right now? There are certainly a lot of them out there and some that are emerging just now. But who are the ones? You've already mentioned Rob Wolf. Who are some of the other ones that have influenced the way you think about this issue?
I would say the researchers themselves, first and foremost. Someone that you have recently had on your show and that I respect tremendously would be Dr. Robert Lustig.
Yeah.
I would add Gary Taubes to that. I think his first book was great. I think that it needs to be expanded upon. His hypothesis, as stated in the book, isn't entirely correct, but that's fine. I think that he's done a great job in bringing to light the detriments of excess carbohydrate in the diet. I guess I would take the same stance as Dr. Lustig on that, in that it may be more fructose than carbohydrate. What was that?
I was just going to ask you, what was it that you did not agree with him on? So you believe it's more the fructose than the total carbohydrate?
It's more that I would like more research to show that. I'm not, and just like Robert Lustig, I'm not entirely convinced that that all carbohydrates are bad.
Right. And I would think Gary Taubes would agree with that. He
Absolutely.
Would say, let's have more research done on it so we can find out.
Absolutely. And then there's a lot of people who are working in the low-carb field, I guess, Volek and others that I find very inspiring. And then I would say Eliseo Fasano, who is doing excellent research on the leaky gut syndrome and the implications with regards to type 1 diabetes, as well as celiac disease and other autoimmune diseases. So these researchers are...
Where is he at?
I believe the Medical School of Maryland, if I remember correctly.
I'm going to have to look him up for an interview.
He does fantastic work. He also gives fantastic talks. Really, really knowledgeable individual. I hugely enjoy reading his papers. Right. He does a fantastic job.
So what about the bloggers? Any bloggers excite you?
Absolutely. I have to say that I am amazed at the richness of the blogging community with respect to paleo, low carb, etc. There are some fantastic people in there. I particularly enjoy, I would say, the whole health source. I think is really good. Stephan Guinet, that's right. As well as Panu by Dr. Harris, the Heart Scanning blog by Dr. Davis. Right. What used to be known as Nephropal, but I believe is now Evolutionary Medicine.
Right.
Really good stuff, especially if you're steeped in biochemistry and chemistry. He puts stuff out there that I drool over. I think it's just totally awesome. And then, of course, there's others such as Rob Wolf, Mark Sisson, etc. All of them that are doing just excellent work. John Durant, that's right. John Durant, I can't forget John. He's a good friend. And, of course, yourself. It's hard not to forget anybody, but like I've said, the field is full of truly fantastic bloggers.
What do you think about Lauren Cordain? I know you did not mention him, and he's the quote-unquote father of the paleo diet.
That's right. I mean, and if you were to ask him, he'd probably say Boyd Eaton would be the father of the paleo diet.
Right.
And I really, from a scientific standpoint, appreciate the effort that Cordain has put into popularizing the diet, and I think that he deserves a huge amount of credit for that. I did forget his blog and his efforts there, but that doesn't mean I don't absolutely respect the work that he's done. I do disagree with him on certain topics to the point where I think that more research would be needed in order to make the statements that he makes. But at the end of the day, I think that the paleo diet is correct. What I disagree with, and what I've mentioned already, is that just because a caveman did it doesn't mean that we should do it or that it was good for us. I think that it's just like an observational study. It is a good place to start. It's a great hypothesis, right, but you can't say that without testing it. And that has gotten him into trouble in the past, particularly, I would say, with saturated fat.
Right. He's changing on that.
He is changing on that, yes. I've heard him say that. I don't know in what way that he's changing on that. In a recent talk that he gave at a CrossFit football nutrition certification, it was more or less, if you're really healthy, you can eat more saturated fat, but if you're not, you can't. And where does his evidence for that come from? I would really like to know.
Yeah.
And I have to say, when it comes to the whole dairy scenario, it's true that cavemen did not have access to that. I won't disagree with him on that. But a lot of the research that he uses to vilify dairy was performed with dairy that was provided by grain-fed animals, as opposed to grass-fed animals. And the difference is night and day with respect to the anti-nutrients that you'll find in the milk of grain-fed animal, as well as to the good nutrients that you won't find in that milk of grain-fed animal, such as CLA, a better omega-3 to omega-6 balance, et cetera, et cetera. And it's been shown that those anti-nutrients and, of course, a poor balance of omega-6, omega-3 can contribute to symptoms of the metabolic syndrome. So it's really difficult for me as a researcher to vilify dairy without having better research. I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm just saying that I would not go that far with the research that I currently have. I cannot make a statement on that.
Well, it should be qualified is what I hear you saying, that we should say, well, if it's grain-fed, absolutely, according to what we know, but grass-fed is still up in the air.
That's right.
Yeah, I changed over to grass-fed meats and cheeses and everything you can think of about a year ago, and it really does make all the difference in the world. The composition of the food that you eat. It's got to nourish you.
That's right.
Well, let's talk about the carbohydrate hypothesis, and this is what Gary Taubes laid out in his book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, well, it's the carbohydrates that raise insulin levels, and high insulin levels is what leads to the problems with health and weight. What's wrong with that hypothesis, and is there a better way to state it?
Yeah, so let's first state that there was a confounding variable in Ansel Keys's epidemiological data, and that confounding variable was sucrose. It turns out that of the countries that he analyzed, the consumption of sucrose increased with the consumption of saturated fat, and he was convinced that saturated fat was the case, and he did not bother to properly analyze the role of fructose in the metabolic syndrome. So now we have the other hypothesis that, well, maybe it's not fat, it's carbohydrate. But the problem is that the carbohydrate, for example, raises insulin, and it is this insulin spike that causes insulin resistance, for example. You would almost have to disagree with, because if you look at the insulin index of various proteins, and amino acids also need the action of insulin in order to penetrate cells. So if you look at the insulin index of various proteins, sometimes they're higher than carbohydrates. For example, I think the insulin index of white fish will be around 51, and that of brown rice would be 40, and that of like whole wheat pasta would be around 40. Mm-hmm. So that, that's right. It's like, okay. So people have been trying to kind of fit a square peg into a round hole by saying, well, the whole proteins, they cause glucagon release, whereas these other proteins, like the stuff that comes from wheat, that comes from legumes, that comes from nuts, it doesn't cause quite as high a glucagon release, and glucagon is implicated in insulin sensitivity. Now, it is true that glucagon is implicated in insulin sensitivity, but the reason why whole protein releases glucagon upon ingestion is to prevent a sugar crash. So if you eat protein and insulin is released and you did not eat any sugar, then there's a chance that your blood sugar is going to crash. So in order to prevent that, your body's going to release glucagon in order to convince the liver to release a little bit of glucose into the bloodstream. That does not happen with, say, or quite as much with, say, nuts, grains, and legumes, protein sources from these foods, because they also contain carbohydrate. Does that make sense?
It's a little over my head, but I'm trying to follow you a little bit.
Okay. So, I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at the data, the insulin spiking, I would say, is probably an effect of the metabolic syndrome. Gotcha. If you eat something and you measure your blood sugars and your insulin, and they just spike after a meal, you're in trouble. Something is going wrong. Right. And you need to fix that. But I think that Dr. Lustig has done a truly phenomenal job in addressing the cause of fructose in the metabolic syndrome and where it is involved, exactly what's it doing. And if you look at the everything from insulin sensitivity to type 2 diabetes to dyslipidemia, depression, etc., it looks like excess fructose consumption is a major factor. It really does. Is implicated in all of these things, much more, say, than saturated fat. In fact, there's no mechanism that I can think of for saturated fat, but there are plenty of mechanisms that biological mechanisms that you can come up with for the implication of fructose. So then again, you get into the situation, well, is it all carbohydrate in general, or is it fructose? And then it's really nice to have this paleo/anthropological crutch to fall back on and say, do we have an example of a population that eats a lot of carbohydrate but doesn't get any diseases of civilization? And we do, and they're called the ketogenics. And if you look at what they eat, it's mostly roots, tubers, and bulbs with some fruit. The fructose content of their diet isn't all that high, but the fiber content of their diet is plenty high. And they're fine. They're absolutely fine.
Is it possible they evolved to be able to adapt to that diet since that's their cultural diet?
That is another possibility, absolutely. And it has been shown that there is an enormous genetic variability when it comes to tolerance of fructose. Mm-hmm. And we see people every day that can eat just about anything they want and remain lean, and that a tolerance to fructose in certain anti-nutrients is definitely bestowed upon those lucky people.
Right. Lucky indeed.
That's right. So when you look... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I know you have stated very clearly there is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate.
That is correct.
It begs the question, why eat them at all?
I would say when it comes to glucose, that can be used by any cell in your body. And it is the preferred fuel for your brain. Your brain absolutely needs glucose to survive, but that doesn't mean that you have to eat glucose to survive. That's why it's not an essential nutrient. Your body can make glucose from the triglycerol backbone of fatty acids, but triglycerides, as well as from glucogenic amino acids via a process called gluconeogenesis. We know from, for example, the Inuits that you can survive and have a good quality of life without eating carbohydrates at all. So that's a very good question. I think in this day and age, I would recommend at least some vegetables or plenty of vegetable matter to get some vitamins, nutrients, as well as probably some iodine, which is something that many of us are deficient in, especially the paleo dieters that just chew salt. Yeah. That makes a huge difference. And I was reading on blogs of people that were getting various problems, and I think iodine is involved in that. We can cover that a little bit later on.
Yeah, I've actually had an expert on that subject on this show, Dr. Jorge Fletches, who is one of the leading voices about iodine and the deficiencies that people are seeing and the ramifications of that deficiency.
Okay. But to get back to the carbohydrate, you are absolutely correct. There's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate, and you can live a healthy life without eating any. I would just like to throw it back to fructose, in that if you look at the scientific literature on fructose, there is absolutely no debate over the fact that chronic overconsumption of fructose causes a variety of health problems. But now I have to weigh the words carefully. I said chronic and I said overconsumption. What people are arguing about right now, and there's a lot of vested interest and dollars invested in this, as you can imagine, is how much fructose can you tolerate? And a post by Alan Aragon comes to mind where, he's arguing about, you can probably tolerate, let's say, 50 to 90 grams of fructose. And this was based on an epidemiological study that was unfortunately funded by a fructose producer, which was Danisco Sweeteners. So the controversy, and of course, Dr. Lustig did weigh in on that post because he's attacking Dr. Lustig directly. The controversy is not, is this good or bad? The controversy is how much can you tolerate? And the problem is that the two sides are using two types of research. So the one side that's saying, listen, you can eat fructose and it's tolerated and it's not going to cause that many problems beyond this point. That side is looking at research that mainly deals with acute consumption of fructose. So that would mean a large dose on the short term. And a large dose on the short term does not cause any problems. That's true. That's fine. However, chronic overconsumption, and that is consuming too much fructose over a long period of time, that causes problems. There's absolutely no doubt. So the two sides are just arguing, and really it all boils down to how much can you tolerate. They're both right. They are both right. Yes, you can eat fructose, and you can eat a large dose one day, and it's not going to do a whole lot of damage. However, that's not what most of the population does. That doesn't reflect reality. What the population does is that it overconsumes fructose chronically, and that causes some major health problems.
Well, it's going to vary from person to person because you've got diabetics out there and people with insulin resistance who really don't need to be having any fructose at all, whereas somebody like yourself could probably handle 100 grams of fructose or something like that. I mean, it's just there is a variety on the spectrum. That's what makes it so difficult, Matt, is people expect a one-size-fits-all answer, and it's just not that easy.
I completely agree. So I guess there are two things I would mention there. Is from a pragmatic point of view, what I prefer to do is to state what you have just stated. Hey, there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. So why bother? I mean, seriously, why am I going to try to bother figuring out how much of this substance, fructose, that can become toxic if overconsumed, should I be trying to consume when it's not necessary? You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
Why bother when glucose will do the job? But now you've brought up a very important point in that the tolerance to glucose and fructose is going to change a whole lot from one person to the next. And then you mentioned diabetics. And what's really interesting is that Professor Robert Lustig, said, I'm not convinced that carbohydrates in general are bad, but fructose is definitely bad. And I would agree with him on that, with the exception of diabetics.
Right.
In the case of diabetics, it seems like the beta cells of the pancreas that produce insulin have burned out to a certain extent, and then the tolerance to carbohydrate, whether fructose or glucose, I would argue these people really should stay away from fructose as much as possible. But even glucose has gone down significantly, and that is when the low-carb approach works really well. So why does low-carb work? Well, it turns out that the majority of the population does have a carbohydrate intolerance because of excess carbohydrate consumption that has to some extent burnt out some of the beta cells of the pancreas. And I would say the low-carb, whether or not paleo, limits your exposure to various foods that a paleo purist would stay away from.
Yeah.
When you're on low carb, you can't eat that much wheat. You can't eat that much rice. You can't eat that many legumes, for example. A lot of the grains and legumes get cut out on a low carb diet.
Right. What about fruit?
Fruit is, have you watched the seminar, the webinar?
I have not had a chance to see your nutrition. Let me tell people about it if you're interested. Go to CrossFitGyms.ca, and on there, Matt recently did a webcast nutrition seminar where he gets very in-depth. If you like what you're hearing today, you definitely want to check that out. How long was it?
It's 8 hours.
8 hours long. So if you're not sick of him by now, then you will be. No, I'm just kidding. You'll definitely need to check it out because it gets into great detail about a lot of what we're talking about today. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I thought you were asking the fruit question because I get a lot of flack when I tell people to limit fruit. Mm-hmm. And it goes to this fact that, there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. Fruits have a little bit too much fructose in them. It is true that certain things like sweet potatoes and whatnot have fructose in them, but typically less than your average fruit, with the exception of lemons and limes. But I typically tell people, I really want you to limit your fruit intake. And the reason for that, and I guess a lot of paleo folks seem to have lost this in the background noise. They seem to forget that we have been selecting over time for sweeter and sweeter fruits via agriculture, without necessarily thinking about the health implications. We are selecting with our taste buds. So if you look at, say, a banana and what it looks like today, what it used to look like, or an apple, for example, the small crab apples, they were very fibrous and contained much less available sugar.
Yeah.
So if you want to attack this from a paleo standpoint, yes, I agree that fruits are quote unquote paleo, but not the fruits that we have today. Unfortunately, they're just too sweet and contain too much sugar. If I'm not mistaken, a banana is about 30 grams of sugar per serving.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, that's
crazy.
That's right. For someone who's on a low-carb regimen, you're looking typically at less than 50 grams a day. So you've almost blown your carb allotment with that.
That's right.
And but I would argue that it's the fructose content of that banana that is even more alarming.
Sure.
So if you stick to things like roots, tubers, and bulbs, it could be yucca roots, such as sweet potatoes, arrowroot, tapioca, all kinds of beets. Beets do have some fructose in them, and if you have sugar beets, they'll have a lot, so you might want to limit that. Anything that is a starchy vegetable, you're going to get plenty of glucose without getting any of while minimizing, I should say, your exposure to fructose. So that's where my recommendation of avoiding fruit comes from. There are things like berries that seem to be fine. Right. Some of them can be a little high on the higher end, like blueberries will be about, I think, 4 grams per 100 grams of fructose. But aside from that, it's not terrible. So the berries tend to be a better choice. So I'm not saying that all fruit is bad, and I'm not saying that all roots, tubers, and bulbs have less fructose than fruit. Sometimes you can find examples. But I just find that by telling people that, you immediately get into a better scenario. Squashes are another really great starchy vegetable to have. But then a little bit more controversies when I tell people, yeah, sure, go ahead and eat potatoes. And then Lauren Cordain would just go medieval on my case and say, that potatoes have saponins and have other anti-nutrients. And the problem is that yes, it's true, the potato is part of the nightshade family. It does contain saponins, and saponins dissolve the gut barrier and are implicated in the leaky gut. They're particularly more potent when they're coupled with a lectin. So, for example, in a tomato or in soy. But with the potato, the stuff is mostly in the skin. So I tell folks, listen, if you don't have access to something like yucca root or a true yam, because what we call yams in the United States are actually sweet potatoes. I've in fact, believe it or not, argued with some people at Whole Foods about this. So if you don't have access to yucca root or a true yam or something that is just starch, then the potato will just peel the darn thing. And then some paleo folks are just going to jump up and down and say, the potatoes are not paleo. And listen, if you look at the science, the anti-nutrients are in the skin, just skin the potato. And if you don't agree with me, then come up with a research, randomized control trial where one group is consuming potatoes with the skin and the other group is consuming potatoes without the skin. And then the other group is consuming, let's say, yucca root, and compare all three. And if the group that is consuming the potato without the skin is still not better off, then fine, I'll believe it. But until then, this whole, childish paleo bugaboo, I cannot be concerned with.
That would be an interesting study to see because I know, Matt, from my own personal experience, I know it's just an anecdote, but a lot of my listeners right now will agree that when they have potatoes, it has a detrimental effect on their insulin levels, on their blood sugar levels. It really can be an unhealthy thing for people with really messed up metabolisms, like so many people who listen to this show.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that, I would say, well, two things probably. As I mentioned previously, if you have issues with control of blood sugar, then there's something going on under the hood that's wrong. And then the two, it is the type of carbohydrate that's in the potato that's highly branched, and it's very easy for the enzymes to just unhook sugar molecules from it. So from an insulin spiking standpoint, it absolutely, that's true.
Yeah.
The potato will do that. But then it gets again to, is it the insulin spiking? Is that a cause or is it an effect? Do we know for sure? Do we have enough research? You see what I'm saying? That those are the limitations.
Sure. It sounds like, and with a lot of my guests, it usually ends up to this conversation, Matt, we need more studies on blank. Whatever it is that is the hypothesis, the theory that's floating around out there, definitely more research would be beneficial. And it sounds like this is an area that you're open to changing your mind about if the research shows it.
Yes, and I would argue that is science.
Right.
Now, that might be suicide in politics, but in science, if you have a hypothesis based on research, or you've come to a conclusion based on research, and then tomorrow there's this new paper that says, yeah, you know what, all of this is wrong because we didn't consider this. There's this new mechanism. We studied it, and it turns out it was all confounding and confused, and now here's what's going on. And you look at it and say, well, okay, it was well done. This is a great hypothesis. You've got to change your mind. And if you don't, I'd say you're a stubborn scientist that won't admit that you're wrong. Science will evolve over time, and people find that frustrating, but I'm sorry, it has to be the case.
Right. Yeah, oftentimes we'll hear people make an argument that, you need to have, let's say, grains, for example, because there's such great nutritional compounds in there that will benefit your health, but you have a different perspective that you'd like to know about regarding the impact of those compounds in that given food on all aspects of the human metabolism. Usually it's so narrowly focused, Matt, on one specific benefit that you forget about, what are the unintended consequences you're getting from consuming that very food.
That's right. And I've actually thrown this at the nutritionists before. There's a few nutritionists and doctors that have come to my seminar, and the nutritionist was just completely baffled and didn't have an answer to it. So let's say I vilify soy, and someone will say, well, there's this one compound in soy that's been shown to have some beneficial effects in this part of human metabolism. And I'll say, yes, I'll agree, assuming the study was done on humans and not on rats. I'll say, yes, I'll agree. But what I would like to know is what is the effect of all of the compounds that are contained in soy on all of the aspects of human metabolism.
Yeah.
Then I will give you an assessment. But from what I know, the answer is no. Like, this stuff is not healthy because, you have not looked at the types of fatty acids that are in there, the effect of the anti-nutrients on metabolism, the fact that most soy today is not fermented, which makes a huge difference as far as the anti-nutrient load is concerned. So you have to look at the big picture.
Yeah. Now, I have a question for you regarding, I guess, those universal foods. What are those foods that every proponent of every kind of diet you can think of would all agree are healthy for people to be consuming?
I think if you were to look at the entire diet spectrum, the only food I can think of would be vegetables. I don't think anybody argues that vegetables are unhealthy. But then if you get into the vegetarian camp, of course, they'll tell you meat is bad.
Right.
You'll find I think the only agreement would be vegetables, probably.
Well, and there is even a segment of the population that talks about not eating any plants because they're full of poison.
That's right. So the zero carbers. That's true. I forgot about the zero carbers. The thing with plants, and this makes a lot of sense when you're a chemist. There are chemists out there that take plants, isolate compounds from them, and then test their effects on various aspects of human metabolism. They're published in journals of natural products, for example. And it is very well known that plants, because they obviously cannot move, have to defend themselves somehow. And the way that they defend themselves is either by making thorns, for example, or by creating toxic compounds that will be toxic to the insects or human eating them. So it's always surprising to me that people are somewhat incredulous when we tell them that there are certain compounds in plants that aren't good for them. It's almost as if it's conspiracy theory. What? You're telling me that something in my food is bad? Something in this plant is bad? Whereas I scratch my head in it and I'm thinking, well, how can you not understand this? This is obvious. Not everything that is in this one plant is going to be good for you. Maybe the majority of it is good for you. Maybe the majority of it is bad for you. But it is well known that some of the most toxic substances known to humans arise from plants. Strychnine being one of them, for example. Very well-known poison. It is. It's a very interesting thing to cover in the seminar, and I take a traditional approach to it, if you will. So I will look at how traditional cultures or how cultures have traditionally prepared things like legumes and grains, and you find out that they're always fermented. And then you look at the chemistry of that, and you see that this fermentation process will reduce the amount of phytic acid, for example. Phytic acid is an anti-nutrient that is found in grains that will bind calcium, magnesium, zinc, and iron. And then you think, hey, whoa, aren't those the metals that most North Americans are deficient in? Well, yes, indeed. And it looks like a major player in that is phytic acid that we do not remove via fermentation. So I would say I agree, and here's a website that I haven't mentioned yet, the Weston Price Foundation.
Right.
I agree with them that fermented grains are healthier for you. I would disagree with them in that I don't think they should be incorporated in the diet. What I'm looking for at the end of the day is what is optimal. I'm not looking for what can be tolerated. And fermented grains and legumes are tolerated. They are better for you than the unfermented option. So with that, I will not argue with the Weston Price Foundation. I just think that they're unnecessary. There's absolutely nothing that you can not find in any other food that is found in grains and legumes.
Yeah.
In fact, you can make an argument that other foods are superior in their nutrient, protein, carbohydrate content.
Most of this audience would agree with that assessment. Now, it begs the question, what do you eat on a daily basis?
I essentially stick to the prescription that I give in the seminar. It's meat, vegetables, roots, tubers, and bulbs, animal fats, as well as avocado, olives, and coconut, products, oils, everything that's derived from that.
Right.
Very little fruit. I might have berries on the weekend. And then I minimize nuts and seeds. And then this is another thing that I get into trouble with the paleo folks. Nuts and seeds are paleo. That's true, that they were available before the onset of agriculture. That's true. But if you look at their composition, for example, grains are seeds. They are the seeds of grasses. Whereas things like pseudo-cereals, quinoa, those are the seeds of broadleaf plants. So it looks like seeds, and this makes sense. If the plant is going to protect itself, it's going to protect its seeds even more. It's going to make sure that its genes get passed on to the next generation, because at the end of the day, that's all that matters. So those seeds are protected by a variety of anti-nutrients. And if you look at, for example, almonds and whatnots, they do contain very similar anti-nutrients to grains and legumes. It's just that the concentration is a lot lower. And it's a lot lower because they have found another way to protect themselves, and that is most nuts have really hard shells. And in fact, what we call nuts today are, from a botanical standpoint, they're actually not nuts. Most of them are fruits anyways. So that's fine, but the various seeds, especially things like sunflower seeds, are really, really high in linoleic acid. And linoleic acid is an omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid that, when consumed in excess, wreaks havoc on metabolism. So I mentioned earlier that there were three things that I was very concerned with: and linoleic acid, fructose, grain, and then the anti-nutrients in grains and legumes. So linoleic acid is a huge player in the metabolic syndrome, and it's found in fairly high concentration in seeds. And it is true that seeds were available before the onset of agriculture, but they were not available in the way that they are now, not in large quantities. So if you think of a human being picking seeds, after an hour, you barely have a handful.
Yeah.
Whereas I can go to Trader Joe's and eat an entire jar of almond butter. So this is a very different thing.
Yeah. So another one of those tolerated but not optimal.
That's right.
Arguments.
So you can have some sunflower seeds on your salad, for example, but I would disagree in let's say chowing down an entire jar of sun butter.
Yeah.
I think that really you need a limit on that material. They're fairly easily oxidizable. They get incorporated into various tissues in the cell membranes, and then they make those cells susceptible to oxidation. That causes inflammation. They also inhibit the omega-3 pathway to a certain extent, because those share very similar enzymes, which then messes up eicosanoid balance to a small extent, not to a huge extent, but they're implicated in a variety of mechanisms. And then I'd say lastly, they also cause insulin resistance and mess with leptin levels as well as adiponectin levels that are secreted from adipocytes. So they're, when you look, and then this is what I keep repeating, when you look at it from a scientific standpoint, as opposed to just, well, my cutoff is 15,000 years ago, you get a slightly different answer. You get when it comes to the foods, the list is similar, and that is that what I just mentioned, meat, vegetables, roots, tubers, and bulbs, animal fats, all those those are all paleo. But it's just that the specifications are a little bit different. So I'd say limit the fruit because that is different. I'd say limits the nuts and seeds because of the linoleic acid content and whatnot. So this is more or less how I eat. I would say I eat only twice a day, and that's just because it's convenient. I guess that means that I somewhat do what people call a compressed window intermittent fasting. I don't think that's important, and I don't want to get into that because that can be really disastrous for people who have metabolic problems. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it can be. It's just intermittent fasting is something that I only talk about at the end of my seminar, and I mention it there because I don't want anybody messing with that until their diet is dialed in, their metabolic problems have disappeared, they have good sleep, stress is low, training is smart. Then if you want to play around with intermittent fasting, fine, go ahead. But until all those things are in place, I don't want to see it. I'd say these other things are much more important. And that gets to the fact that, nutrition is not the end-all, be-all. There's also, stress, exercise, sleep, a lot of other things that'll get into it. But it is a huge pillar of health and longevity.
It's the good first step.
It's a good first step. That's right.
Yeah. Well, speaking of first step, even people on a traditional diet can have issues that come up that prevent them from having the physique that they're desiring. Why is that? Why is it that Inuits and Eskimos who consume this diet we've been talking about today, why can they sometimes still be, as you called it in your notes to me, chubby?
Yeah, I added that in there because it's a recurring inside joke amongst my friends. There is a blogger who is named Lay Peel, who put up a blog post that is, something in fat loss and insulin, they just don't get it. And unfortunately, I think I cannot find very much in that blog that is scientifically correct. And so I was going to discard the post until in the video she says that the low carbers, something I'm not quoting directly, but she says that these high fat or low carb diets, they can't be all that good for you because the Inuits, they have chubby cheeks, and at that point I just lost it. I almost snapped my computer in half,
She's been on this show before.
Okay. And I just started ranting about it to friends, and I thought it was you cannot know everything. Yeah. I will admit that, but I just thought that was so ignorant on her part that it was not pardonable. The Inuit have chubby cheeks because they live in a very cold environment, right. And it has been shown that if you take an individual and make them swim in very cold waters, for example, the individuals that train to cross the English Channel, they will develop a layer of subcutaneous fat that covers their entire body. It is for insulation purposes. And I thought that was either a low blow on her part or it was completely ignorant, one or the other. But yeah, that comment just it is not a legitimate criticism of low carb diets, and it is purely misleading.
So it does offer up another question of people who do eat low carb, who still struggle, and paleo, who still struggle with getting their weight down to what most would say is an optimal level. What's going on with those people? Why are they struggling so much?
So there's a few things. The liver is hugely implicated in the metabolic syndrome, and it looks like, from what we've seen, the damage there can be reversed by changing the diet. Unfortunately, the damage that's done to the pancreas is not quite as much reversible. Right. But aside from those things, I would say let's assume that the metabolic problems are fixed. It might be excess cortisol, and by that I mean too much stress. Right. And that can come from psychological stress, and let's say having a bad family environment or work environment. It can come from excess exercise, too much exercise. And this is something that Gary Tobbs covers a little bit in his book, and he got a lot of flack about. Yeah. And it is true that too much exercise can increase your cortisol level and make you hold on to some excess weight. And then lack of sleep is also a huge factor. What we see as well for certain females is the birth control pills mess with estrogen levels and prevent further leaning out. So that those are issues that I would mention.
Yeah,
and that I think can be responsible for that. They play a significant role.
Absolutely.
I would say Mark Sisson is a huge proponent of if you want to train, here's how you want to train. You're going to lift weights 2 times a week. You're going to sprint about once a week, and then the rest of your exercise should be high volume, low intensity stuff, walking, hiking, and whatnot. Right. And if you look at figure competitors, people who really excel at getting their body weight and their body fat percentages really low. I'm not saying that everything those people do is healthy, by the way. Don't quote me on that. I'm not saying that it's healthy. I'm just saying they're really good at that. And you look at their training, and it's essentially that.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier that low-carb diets work. You agree with Dr. Lustig on this point, not just because of fructose avoidance, but because of some grain avoidance for certain people that have those metabolic issues we've been talking about. But you also brought up the fat issue, and that sometimes people who choose to eat a low-carb diet run into trouble because they eat the, quote, wrong types of fats.
That's right.
What are the wrong types of fats? We know about trans fats, but what are some other wrong types of fats that people need to be aware about?
So I would say excess linoleic acid, as I've mentioned before. Now, it turns out that if you're getting, say, grain-fed versus grass-fed meat, it is true that the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is not ideal. It'll be more like 10 to 1 as opposed to 3 to 1 or maybe 1 to 1. But the amount of fat that's in there it's not that high. It's not going to make that high of a difference. So if you only have access to, let's say, grain-fed meat and you take some fish oil, you'll be fine. You're probably going to undo at least the omega-6, omega-3 balance. But then there's a lot of toxins that get stored into fat. So if the animal was fed a lot of garbage, you're unfortunately going to be eating some of that. So that's an issue there. But yeah, linoleic acid, I would say, is is definitely the omega-6 fatty acid to avoid in excess. And then you look at where it's found in grains, legumes, and seeds. That's where you're going to find omega-6 linoleic acid mostly. I would say that's probably, aside from trans fats, I would say that is the one fat that I would avoid. And by trans fats, I mean synthetic trans fats, things like ellatic acid. I'm not talking about conjugated linoleic acid or vaccinic acid that are truly beneficial to human metabolism. So it's, at the end of the day, when I'm done with the seminar, it's like, look, it's everybody's right and everybody's wrong. It's true that, there are fats that are bad. It's true that there are carbohydrates that are bad, but not all of them are bad.
Right.
Some of them are good. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of people when they start the paleo diet. For example, I could have someone on a paleo diet who is vegan and as a fat source eating mostly sunflower seeds and as a carbohydrate source eating mostly fruits, and I don't think that person would be really healthy. I'm not preaching carnivorism or veganism or whatnot. At the end of the day, I just give you a list of foods, and I'm like, listen, I don't care what you are. If you choose from this list of foods, you'll be healthier. And that's all I care about.
Right.
Yeah, so I've often been quoted as saying, if a physician were to ask me, create a diet, no matter what the caloric amount, that will make someone sick, that would guarantee will make someone sick, and using real food, something you go to a supermarket and buy off the shelf. So the protein source would be seitan, which is pure wheat gluten. The carbohydrate source would be agave nectar, which is about 90% fructose. Yeah. And the fat source would be corn oil. Now, that certainly does not sound appetizing, but I guarantee you that you can find those in a supermarket, and that anyone who eats those foods, no matter what the caloric intake, will be diseased.
And you'll find all three in the shopping cart of someone who thinks they're eating healthy.
That's right. Unfortunately,
yeah. Well, we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you about this troubleshooting paleo. You've given a couple of ideals. We mentioned iodine earlier. Go ahead and tell us why iodine deficiency is such an issue, not just with paleo and low-carb dieters, but pretty much all dieters.
Yeah, that's right. It turns out that a while ago, the salt supply was iodized because it was recognized that iodine in our diets was really low, and that's because it's not part of fertilizer, for example, and we're depleting it from the soil without replenishing it. And iodine is hugely important in the synthesis of thyroid hormones, mainly T4, which is then transformed into T3 via a deiodinase enzyme. Right. So having low levels of those, and this, again, is something that relates to a question that you asked earlier, and that is, even if someone is eating properly, let's say that they're fairly iodine deficient, then yeah, that could probably, I would say, use a term that Rob Wolf likes to use. It would cock block their fat loss, and that is that it would minimize the rate at which they're losing fat. It may also detrimentally affect their metabolism. So iodine is hugely important there. And I think if you don't want to go with supplements, just have some seaweeds from time to time or some sea vegetables. They're really rich in iodine. I personally think they're delicious. They add a really good variety to the diet too. Yeah. And they will avoid that problem. One thing that's interesting about, say, the Japanese is that whenever they eat soy, for one, it's fermented. It's miso, tempeh, or natto, stuff like that. But they also have it with many sea vegetables, and that iodine tends to make up for the fact that the soy has goitrogenic compounds, which will negatively impact your thyroid function. The other two things I have in that section is another complaint that I've heard quite a bit, and that is the complaint of diarrhea. Yeah. There are people that will go on a low-carb diet or that will go on a paleo diet, and they're crippled by a bout of diarrhea. What's going on here is that there is a physiological limit to the amount of protein and to the amount of fat that you can digest in a given day. If you go above, I would say, 35 to 40% of calories as protein, you will get close to suffering from something called rabbit starvation. Wow. So excess protein, lean protein, in the absence of fat will cause this. And the first symptom is diarrhea. Now, there's a lot of people that say, oh my God, this is dangerous because you can die from it. True, in a really extreme bout of that, you can die. But if all you have is diarrhea, you're fine. Just, watch your protein intake. But then you also have to watch your fat intake. If your calories from fat, and of course this will depend on an individual, since most North Americans don't eat that much fat, our ability to digest fat has to catch up when we go on a high-fat diet.
Right.
So I would say the number there is about 70 to 85% of calories. You probably can't go beyond 85% of calories as fat. Then you will, again, get a crippling bout of diarrhea. And this is bad news. You're losing fat-soluble vitamins, of course, some water and whatnot, and it causes a variety of other problems. Digestion is poor, for example. So for those folks, I'd say, hey, just don't be quite as zealous about it. Like, yes, I realize this paleo and low-carb stuff is fun, but you got to watch it a little bit and back off either the protein or the fat. It's typically the fat that people will overdo first, but I've seen some folks overdo the protein. I've actually done this myself. I was listening to a podcast. Rob Wolf has this excellent podcast, The Paleolithic Solution, and he was saying that he was cutting back his fat intake a little bit and leaning out. And I was wondering, I wonder if I'm eating too much fat. So I started cutting back my fat intake. But then that changed my protein to fat ratio.
That's right.
And I got this crippling bout of diarrhea, and it got worse the more lean protein I ate. So if I went to, say, shrimp and scampies and stuff like that, it got worse. And so I realized, oh, okay, not only is there a certain percent of calories that you have to pay attention to, there's also a ratio that you have to pay attention to. And that kind of made a lot of sense to me, because when I first went paleo, and I would say low-carb paleo, I put on a significant amount of muscle mass. And I think that's because there's various hormonal effects, of course, that are involved here. But I was able to maximize my protein intake by being low-carb because I had so much fat in there that I could tolerate more protein. Yeah,
So what is an ideal ratio? I know for me, a very high-fat, moderate protein, low-carb approach works good for me, and that translates to something like 70-20-10.
That's right.
And honestly, when I first started eating low-carb, Matt, I had those diarrhea issues for several months, and it was just it took time for my body to get accommodated to that, and I put up with it because I knew and I was seeing results. So
that's right.
For me, having diarrhea and taking off 180 pounds, I'll take the diarrhea. Thank you very much. And is there anything people can do to kind of ward off the diarrhea effects?
Yeah. You can take it a little bit more slowly and increase the fat and diminish the carbohydrate a little bit at a time, just to give your gallbladder a chance to keep up. So it's the bile salts, the bile salt production that is insufficient, and your body just has to catch up a little bit. So instead of doing it cold turkey and making a huge switch, you can do it gradually, and that will probably help.
Yeah. And in fact, some fat sources can lead to diarrhea. I know the first time I ever took MCT oil or coconut oil, whoa, I was like, I need to back off on this just a little bit.
Yeah. So again, the problem with those is that the caloric content is enormous.
Yeah.
So it's really hard. It's really easy to go beyond that, 70, 85% of calories from fat using those sources. I think that's, again, people are under the impression that if they're paleo or if they're low carb, that they can eat as much as they want and lose weight. And I would say you can, if you are seriously metabolically deranged, you can eat a little bit more as long as the food quality is there. You are going to lose weight, but then you will plateau. And to keep on losing weight, you will have to create a certain caloric deficit. But at the end of the day, food quality is much more important than food quantity. But by that, I don't mean that you can eat as much as you want and still lose weight. That would still be untrue. So you still have to look at the calories at the end of the day. But the whole calories in, calories out is flawed as it is currently taught, because assumes that the human body is a bomb calorimeter, and we're actually driven by hormones. So you have to look at the hormonal effect of food as opposed to just the caloric content.
Right. It assumes all calories are created equal, which makes these 100-calorie packs the most idiotic marketing trend we've ever seen in American history.
Absolutely. I mean, and then if you look at the effect of low-fat, people would buy low-fat snacks and just eat more because they're low-fat.
Oh, I did. I bought snack wells like they were going out of style, man. Back in my low-fat days. So crazy stuff. His name is Matt Lalonde. Visit his website, crossfitgyms.ca. And while you're there, check out his webcast, which is now available for you to watch online. You can purchase a copy of that 8 hours long. So if you're not sick of Matt Lalonde yet, you really should go check that out. Just kidding, Matt. They're not going to be sick of you. You've been such a pleasure having here today on the Livin' La Vida Low-Carb Show.
Well, thank you for having me on, Jim.
Coming up next time on the Livin' La Vida Low-Carb Show, the blood type diet founder and creator, Dr. James D'Adamo. Visit our website at thelivinlowcarbshow.com/show notes and email us anytime at LLVLCshow@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.